Hi everyone, my name is Donna Lyons. I'm with the School of Law at Trinity College Dublin, and this is seminar 9 in our speaker series. So I'm really delighted to welcome Professors Eric Posner and Jack Goldsmith to the School of Law to discuss reform of the US presidency after Donald Trump this evening. As you know, Eric Posner is Kirkland and Ellis Distinguished Service Professor of Law, as well as Arthur and Esther Kane Research Chair at the University of Chicago Law School. Professor Posner is a prolific writer and recently published a book on this subject called The Demagogue's Playbook, The Battle for American Democracy from the Founders to Trump. And we were lucky enough to discuss that book as part of this series earlier in September of this year. So in The Demagogue's Playbook, Eric offers a blueprint for how America can prevent the rise of another demagogue and protect the features of democracy that help it to thrive. Jack Goldsmith is Learned Hand Professor of Law at Harvard University Law School, as well as co-founder of Lawfare and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He served as Assistant Attorney General at the Office of the Legal Counsel from 2003 to 2004 and Special Counsel to the Department of Defense from 2002 to 2003. Professor Goldsmith, who's also a prolific writer, recently published a book on this subject with Bob Bauer called After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency, which will form a core part of our discussion today. And in After Trump, the authors provide a comprehensive roadmap for reform of the presidency in the post-Trump era, whether that comes next week or in 4 years' time. So I guess I'll kick it off with a question for Professor Goldsmith. Why did you feel this work was necessary in our current legal and political climate? What inspired you to write this book at this moment in time?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me on, and thanks to Eric for agreeing to have this chat with me. So Bob Bauer and Bob actually, I think it's important to know, he was the White House counsel for Barack Obama, and he and I were going to write a book. We'd set out to write a book about the White House counsel's office. I used to work with the White House counsel. He was a White House counsel. I was in a different administration, a Republican administration. We were going to write a book about that, and in the course of thinking about that book, we decided that it would be more useful to write a book considering the book that we wrote. And the answer to your question why we wrote this book is it seemed obvious to us, and it seems even more obvious now, that there's going to be, when Trump leaves the scene, whether that's in January 20th or 4 years from January 20th, when he leaves the scene, there's going to be a large debate about reforming the presidency to because Trump has revealed in a whole bunch of ways, maybe we can get into them later, revealed in a whole bunch of ways that the accountability constraints and the normative constraints on the presidency that grew up 50 years ago after Watergate, after Vietnam and the like, and that worked fairly well for 50 years, didn't work so well in some surprising and not really anticipatable or not obviously anticipatable ways because Trump was such a strange president. So in any event, there's going to be a debate about whether the president is adequately constrained, whether the president has adequate accountability. This book lays out a whole bunch of reforms, but more importantly, I mean, our aim really was to kind of be a part of the debate. For every issue, we don't just say what we believe should be the reform. We give the historical background. We talk about what Trump did. We compare it to other presidents. So we hope that this book can be like a handbook to think about reform, even if you don't buy the particular reforms that we propose.
Thank you so much. Okay, so just referring to the preface in the book, you talk about Trump's mercurial personality, his pathological mendacity, his shamelessness, his open disrespect for law and norms, vicious attacks on officials and institutions, intermingling of public and private interest, and indifference to facts, and the damage that all of that has done. And how his excesses of authority have been very damaging to the institution of the presidency. So I'm just wondering how, in your mind, and maybe in your own words, did he abuse the presidential power? If you wanted to go into a bit more detail about that.
Sure. So Trump did not abuse presidential power in all of the traditional ways that American presidents abuse presidential powers. He didn't, unlike George W. Bush, for example. Trump violated the law sometimes, or arguably violated the law, but that was true of Bush, that was true of Obama, that's true of presidents for a whole bunch of reasons. The legal lines that govern the presidency are often unclear. Presidents have an incentive to get things done, especially when Congress is deadlocked. some of Trump's predecessors' typical excesses he didn't commit. I mean, he was less aggressive in exercising war powers and in exercising unilateral war powers than his predecessors. He didn't, as much as George W. Bush, the president I worked for, he didn't to the same degree claim or in practice exercise a power to disregard statutes, to say that his constitutional power was so broad that he could disregard statutes. He claimed a lot of constitutional power, but he didn't do a lot of disregarding of statutes. Unlike, or at least not to a lesser extent than Barack Obama, Trump did not aggressively use the administrative state and aggressively read congressional delegations to enhance to basically promulgate favored regulations. Those were the kind of things we debated about in past presidents. Trump was different. He and again, I don't want to deny that he violated the law sometimes, and he certainly expressed a desire to violate the law a lot of times, and he tried in some instances and mostly failed. His characteristic abuses were some of the following. One, and this is nothing I'm saying is news. Eric talked about a lot of this stuff in his book. And in fact, we quote Eric's book in describing Trump's essence as a demagogic president. He merged the institution of the presidency with his private interests. So he was, for example, in not disclosing his taxes and hiding where his money was and hiding his financial interests, in basically abusing and ignoring the conflict of interest rules, and in mixing his business interests with his public interests, and serving his private interests with his public duties. These are all, let me just back up and say, these are all things that come under the heading of norm violations. And Trump was the norm violator par excellence. So I just mentioned some. There was a longstanding norm on how presidents should treat their business interests. Trump disregarded it. Longstanding norm on presidential tax disclosure, he disregarded it. Longstanding norm about presidents not intervening publicly or even privately, but especially publicly in pending cases, especially ones that touched on the president's interest, violated it all the time. Calling on to prosecute his opponents, using his control over diplomacy and law enforcement to nudge foreign powers to help him win the election. His persistently self-regarding use of the pardon power. Again, some presidents use the pardon power in self-regarding ways. Trump did it something like 90% of the time, according to our calculations. He also attacked all of the major institutions of American government, from the press. I mean, and when I say attacked, and again, I'm not saying anything novel here, viciously, persistently, and in extreme and often mendacious terms, attacked the press, the executive branch that underneath him, the various agencies he didn't like, the Congress, private persons, everything, every institution that he saw as any kind of constraint to him, he tried to attack. He tried to violate the law, but he didn't succeed very often, in part because norms worked better. But that gives you a flavor of the kind of things he did. And let me just say there are two problems with this. One, he did a lot of damage to these institutions just by the institutions that he was flaunting and attacking. And two, the worry is that the next demagogic president will be much more competent than Trump was. Another one of Trump's characteristics was that he was actually fairly incompetent in many areas when it came to wielding executive power, especially the areas of executive power that required coordination with someone outside of the Oval Office. A pardon power, you can bring the president a piece of paper, he can sign it, and it's basically over with. But when it comes to getting the Justice Department to prosecute one of your political enemies, that's a lot harder to do. And Trump didn't have the information or the will or the intelligence to kind of make those things happen, but a future president could. So those are some of the ways that he abused presidential power.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump in because, listening to you, there's kind of a paradox when you think about Trump compared to his predecessors, because you could make the argument that the predecessors, as you point out, actually violated the law, more explicitly and more sort of consequentially than Trump did. And what's offensive about Trump are these actions he took, which are, not really a violation of the law, but are harmful in some broader sense. Or maybe one way to put it is, if somebody in the government actually followed through and and did what Trump wanted him to do, it would be pretty extreme. I mean, put aside for a moment the financial records, his threats to prosecute people, his political opponents, which are pretty much unprecedented. There's some marginal historical examples, but he actually never did. Right? Biden hasn't been prosecuted. No one has. He also wanted the Justice Department not to prosecute some Republicans, and that apparently had no effect either. He tried to nudge foreign powers, like they weren't nudged. Like Ukraine did not investigate Biden, and let me put the pardon power aside again. With the financial stuff, the attack on the press and the courts seem to have, in the case of the press, clearly backfired. The press has never seemed as aggressive and kind of full of zeal, and the courts seem not to have been intimidated by Trump at all. So there's a weird way in which he's been powerless. And, you might think that future presidents looking at what Trump did might think, we're not going to do this. It didn't work for Trump. It's not going to work for us. I think actually the most alarming thing Trump has done, I'm curious whether you agree, Jack, has to do with the election. His threats, not to concede the election, if he loses, his attempts to throw doubt on the integrity of mail-in ballots, and his participation in the Republicans' longstanding efforts to suppress voting. But even then, he might just concede, right? The real problem is he's a powerful person. People don't know what he's going to do, so they have to, they have to prepare. The Democrats have to prepare. But in the end, he may do nothing at all, which would be consistent with the last 4 years.
Yeah, so I have those are great points. I don't disagree with them. We made acknowledge some of those points right at the beginning of the book. And there is this paradox that his bark has often been much louder and much more salient than his actual bite. And I agree with those examples. I mean, I would say, though, it's a couple of things. One, first of all, the fact that he wasn't able to achieve those things is in many instances a testament to norms that people think were trashed and non-consequential. Norms and related laws that bucked them up, they were actually, in my judgment, much more consequential during the Trump period than they were given credit for. Now, you might think that cuts against the need for reform, but I don't think so. We don't think so for a couple of reasons. One, even though for kind of the same reasons as what you said about his threats about the election, even though he didn't succeed in getting his political opponents prosecuted, and even though he didn't succeed in firing the special counsel, he did two things. One, he certainly damaged confidence in these institutions and the legitimacy of these institutions, which is one of his aims, something you talk about in your book, trying to damage and denigrate these elite institutions. He succeeded in that, so there needs to be a project to try to sort of buck up the appearance and the reality of the legitimacy and, depending on the context, the even-handedness of these institutions. Second, he gave a playbook that we think that a more clever president can use to really use these institutions in a way that would be more damaging. I agree, though. I agree that some of his stuff is back. It's quite possible. It's a possible state of affairs that there could be no reform at all. I'll give you some exceptions to this, but there could be no need for reform at all, that we'll just snap back, and that the next president will go back to following the norms and everything will be fine. On some of these things, though, and again, we're talking broadly across about 20 different areas of possible reform. You said setting aside the conflict of interest and financial stuff, that is really insidious when the president is mixing public and private business. And we don't think that should be left to norms at all. No president should ever be able to violate those, and there should be an easy way to fix those things.
Jack, what would a clever president do next time? Let's suppose we have a clever demagogue in office. in a few years, what would he do, better than Trump? How would he go after political opponents?
I mean, he would have definitely gotten Mueller fired. He would have.
How? Like,
it's very simple. I mean, if Trump had, I mean, he would have I would be surprised if Barr, as Attorney General, which he wasn't at the time until the very end, if ordered by the president to fire Mueller, wouldn't have done that.
So the clever president would have fired Sessions earlier and replaced Sessions with somebody who would have fired Mueller. Is that your
among other things? And there's obviously gets very complicated, but yes, the Mueller report might not have come out. That was a conceivable state of affairs, and Barr followed through because he pledged at his confirmation hearing to have it come out, but it was in his authority not to have it come out, and we don't think that should be within his authority going forward. A clever president would have kept his mouth shut about prosecuting his political enemies, therefore making it easier for a future attorney general. For example, who's the number two, the deputy FBI director? I can't remember his name. And McCabe. McCabe was actually, the inspector general said that McCabe had done some things that might have been a criminal violation. And some of the other things that the inspector general uncovered could have been bases for criminal prosecutions. Trump blew it by talking about it in public and urging the attorney general to do it. So he could have been much more effective if he, part of it being more effective is keeping your mouth shut and operating kind of behind the scenes. But I think that those kind of things, a cleverer president could have been much more successful.
So it's odd though, because if he had kept his mouth shut, he wouldn't have damaged these norms as much, right? We think he damaged the norms by telling everybody that the Justice Department was his political.
But the norms, following the norms is not an end in itself. You follow the norms to prevent the underlying behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want again, you understand this. You want the norms to be in place to prevent both the appearance and the reality of the behavior you want to prevent. So I actually think Trump damaged himself in trying to achieve his ends. He never, again, there's so many things that are paradoxical about Trump. He never, in many ways, he was hugely consequential in controlling the agenda and in controlling the news. And I want to come back and say something to what you said about the media. But in some ways, he didn't understand the presidency or how it operated in some of the subtle ways that one needs to operate to really achieve one's ends. You see this on the administrative law stuff. I think the last time I looked, 91% of his cases defending his regulations have resulted in losses or at least stalemates, which is historically hugely high because they just didn't invest in the apparatus of, making the government work. And this was a cleverer president could have done that. On the press, let me say, I actually think this is an area where Trump succeeded. You're right that that his attacks on the press, I think, emboldened the press, but it also led them down a path where I think the press has become much more like the press that Trump said they were than they were before they responded to Trump by being so partisan and attacking him. So I think he's actually succeeded in the medium term in delegitimizing the kind of mainstream press. And that's that. I think that's. Do you agree with that? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I want to talk about both of those points. The first one, I can't help thinking there's a kind of a paradox though operating here, because when you say a clever demagogue would be more subtle, Trump thinks, and plausibly, that the way he got political power, and maybe the best way to retain it, is just to fill up the airwaves with his anger and resentments and his accusations and all that stuff. But at the same time, those things weaken the ability of his subordinates from accomplishing their ends. Yeah. So it may be a happy problem for any demagogue, like Nixon. Nixon was much subtler about this sort of stuff, but he was much less popular, And yeah. If we replayed the Nixon administration and he had been much more extreme earlier on, maybe the public wouldn't have turned against him as much as it did. You know, he had 20% behind him by the end, whereas Trump will never have less than 40%. So I don't know, it may be that our system or democracy in general, or at least American democracy, is robust against demagogues. And I think one of the big questions is whether Trump is really a one-off type or whether he's a harbinger. And, you know, that's a big question.
So I don't know the answer to that question, and you studied that in your book much more than I did. I suspect that we're going to see versions of Trump for the foreseeable future, but our book is in part, and you can say that this is a hopeless task, but our book is in part is designed for the next and more clever demagogue,
Right.
as you describe him in your book.
Right. Yeah, and I do want to get back to that, but on the press, you know, it's really kind of complicated, because what happens is, you know, there's this kind of balance of power sort of thing there that as the president becomes more extreme, other people become more alarmed. You know, people who disagree with him, people who ideologically or for other reasons disagree. Those people have thrown money into, you know, counter institutions, and they're, you know, to some extent, they're just buying and reading more New York Times subscriptions and all that rest. But also, there's just this money going to people who are attacking Trump, like the Lincoln Project, for example. So I don't know. I mean, so the press is more polarized, I agree, than it was 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know whether it's less legitimate. I don't know. You know, it's an interesting question.
Well, legitimacy, I mean, without getting too far on this path, is a complicated idea here.
Yeah.
Legitimacy before which audiences, and what are they trying to maximize? I think they're maximizing something somewhat. The New York Times is maximizing something different now than it was 4 years ago. But it's extremely complicated, but it's certainly, we're in a world where the authoritative press is diminished. And that's been going on generically for a long time, but Trump is, I think, and it has to do with technology, but Trump has really accelerated that process.
He's probably accelerated. I think, you know, I think the New York Times has probably moved left for fairly narrow business reasons, which is that
I agree.
That they're younger, you know, that younger people are moving to the left and they want them as subscribers, and their advertisers want them. And in fact, their employees are also, and they have to accommodate employees. Maybe that's been accelerated by Trump, but I'm not sure. On your book, on your reforms, you know, it's hard to disagree with them. I think they're sensible. I think the more difficult question is the rot is much deeper, so that we should be focusing on more significant constitutional reform.
Yeah.
But your sorts of reforms are much more realistic than reforming the Electoral College or the Senate, something like that. But they may not do much.
So, well, so let me just comment on that, because it's a good point, and we acknowledge this point in the book. So we focus on reforms of the executive branch, and it's 400 pages of how to reform the executive branch. And the objection you just made, which is perfectly legitimate, is you're focusing on the wrong institution. The real problem here is the electoral system that elected Trump, or the electoral system that has produced the Congress that can't exercise its constitutional responsibilities, which is why we have such a screwed up president, or that Congress itself is screwed up for other reasons. And there's certainly a more ambitious book to be written about how to fix the American political system. It's obviously not our project, it's not my area of expertise. And there is a trade-off between effective, you want to be within the realm of somewhere close to being realistic about what's possible. And you also want to make a difference. And I think that vector does suggest that the short-term focus can be on the president. And again, we're talking about a whole array of reforms. I mean, some of these are targeted and easy, like the financial stuff. Some of them in the back end of the book, like war powers and emergency powers and vacancies reform, monumentally hard, because they implicate old and deep separation of powers questions. But I mean, I think that, you know, how consequential can these reforms be? I don't know. The 70s reforms, which these are analogous to, were very consequential, and they worked, in my judgment, with some tweaks and a few failures, remarkably well for 50 years. I mean, they really were, in retrospect, an extraordinary accomplishment, I think.
Which reform in your book is the most important? Which is the one that you really want to see more than any other?
Get asked that question a lot. There's no single reform like that. Let me tell you why. I think the most important thing is to fix the Justice Department White House relations. I just think, and I think that's also by far in some sense, it's easiest because most of the reforms can happen within the executive branch, but it's really hard to get right. And it's just a perennial problem to try to ensure that because there's just a conflict built into it. The president controls prosecutions by the virtue of the Constitution, and he controls law enforcement. You want to ensure that he doesn't use that and abuse that in a way that's self-serving to himself or his political interests. But of course, we allow for a lot of political interests to factor into that. Trump exacerbated all of these old problems. I think that trying to fix that problem is the most important and most consequential, but it's also the hardest. I mean, and we don't have a silver bullet. We've got about 15 different things that we call for. And who knows how those things would work either in the aggregate or, just whatever gets through. So I think that's the most important, but one of the hardest to get right. I think if you kind of maximize importance or trying to maximize the vectors of importance and ease of passage, I would say the financial stuff should be the first matter of business, first 100 days. Sorry, Donna.
Sorry, Jim, just wondering, do you think any of those reforms, even the most modest ones, can take place if Trump is reelected? Or in terms of your book, are you talking about a Biden presidency?
The official position stated in page 2 is that this is for when Trump leaves office, whether in 2021 or 2025. But none of this is going to happen absent sort of monumental changes in the nature of Congress, which would not have happened if Trump wins re-election. None of this is going to happen while Trump is in office, and most of it wouldn't happen even if there were monumental changes in Congress. And of course, by 2025, if Trump wins this election, these problems are all going to be deepened and different in some sense. So implicitly, even though the book is called After Trump, and we assume 2021 or 2025, these particular reforms are geared towards the possibility of Trump losing the election next week.
If Trump is reelected and he leaves in 2025, what's the country going to be like then?
I mean,
what's our political system going to be?
Are we assuming that he lasts 4 years?
Yeah.
And that he defeats the impeachment attempts?
Yeah.
This is pure speculation, obviously. I think it would be it's hard to imagine how bad it would be. I don't know what our institutions would look like. I think the country would tear itself apart.
What does that mean concretely? I guess so. I'll say I do not think he'll be a dictator, or that he'll.
I don't think he'll be a dictator. No. I don't think he'll be a dictator. I don't buy any of that.
What about the court system? Do you think the court system would be okay in 2025? The judges, people.
The court system considered alone. Again, it's hard to separate that out from whether there's revolution in the streets. But setting aside that possibility, I think the court system, if Trump wins, will be fine. It'll be conservative. It'll be really conservative. He gets 4 more years, especially if he controls the Senate. But even if he doesn't control the Senate, it would still be pretty conservative for 4 years. And it would make a lot of people, especially a lot of people we know well, very unhappy. But I don't think in any fundamental way, and there would be, I think that the law professoriate would basically melt down. I'm not sure they would survive those 4 years.
Well,
but setting that aside, I think the courts will, be operating basically as usual. The interesting question is going to be how conservative is a 6-3
right.
conservative Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, if they're conservative, the country's been through that. The bad thing would be is if they're, throwing Democrats in jail, and you don't anticipate.
No chance.
What
Zero chance.
What about the FBI or the Justice Department?
This is something to worry about more if Trump wins, because Trump has learned in 4 years. And again, a lot of it depends on who controls the Senate, whether he can get his nominees through and the like. So there are a lot of contingencies here. But assuming that he could put people in place, I think that you could expect I think that he can bring his will more to bear on those institutions than he did in the first 4 years. How much is very unclear. At some point, as you know, after the top levels of the political appointees who themselves, it's actually very hard. This kind of cuts against what I was saying earlier. It's actually very hard to find people at the very top of these institutions who are political appointees who can get through the Senate, who are just going to go crazy and do whatever a crazy Trump says. It's actually very hard to do that. But
Right,
even
that's
so,
quite
yeah, I agree with that. Which is not to say that there's not a lot of mischief that can happen in between those that can still happen. But I agree with that. And in part, that's because there's this large, thick layer below of bureaucrats through whom they have to work and institutions and cultures that they have to deal with. So I don't think it would be, I actually don't think a second term Trump would be locking up his opponents and prosecuting his opponents. He would probably still call for it. I don't see that happening. But the appearance of injustice, the appearance of non-even-handed justice, the appearance of politicized law enforcement, which is terrible now, would grow much worse. And that's a very bad thing.
Maybe we'll talk about executive constraints is something that came up just there. So Connor Casey is going to ask a question of both of you. So Connor's a Max Weber postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute. He did his undergrad and doctoral studies at Trinity and has a master's from Yale Law School. So if you'd like to go ahead there, Connor.
Thanks very much, Donna, and to Professors Posner and Goldsmith. I had the great fortune a few years ago, actually, of being in a class taught by Professor Goldsmith, along with Professor Sita Raman, who's a visiting professor, on your book, Accountability and Constraint, based on the modern presidency, which is a great book. And this feels like a sequel to it in some respects, so I look forward to it.
Kind of a depressing sequel.
My question concerns the Office of Legal Counsel, which I know you've both written about, and Professor Goldsmith, you were the head of for a period.
And it's not well known that Professor Posner worked there when he was a young man.
When I was a youngster.
All the better for this question. So my question is how you would assess his performance. Has it served to prove Professor Ackerman right, that it's a sort of constitutional gasoline for the fire of executive power, or has it served sort of behind the scenes to curb the outer bounds of executive authority? So just wondering how you would assess its performance.
So it's a great question, and it's a very hard question to answer, and here's why. First of all, I mean, my bottom line assessment is I think the Office of Legal Counsel has operated, as best I can tell from reading its opinions and reading between the lines of things that don't happen. It seems to me to have operated basically like Office of Legal Counsels have operated in the past presidents, including the Obama presidency and the Bush presidency, which is to say that it writes these very lawyerly opinions that take rather expansive views of executive power and executive power precedents to reach conclusions supportive of the president. I would say that that's happened about as much and about as controversially as what happened under the Obama administration. There's a big deal made about the OLC opinions about congressional subpoenas, but the truth is that opinion was written by the same senior bureaucrat who has the same views as that person had under the Obama administration, and basically at the end of the day didn't say much different. So on the one hand, I think it seems like we don't know what we don't know, but on the surface, it seems like kind of normal science. But here's what we don't know. It's very hard in the Ackerman and Trevor Morrison debate. It's very hard to know what OLC is actually doing. I can tell you from my experience, you don't see the no's. You don't see when OLC says, no, you can't do that. You don't see, this is like the veto power. You don't see when they don't ask because they know the answer is going to be no. You don't see the back and forth when they say we want to do X and they say you can't do X, but you can try Y. I mean, I definitely don't want to deny, and I just made clear that OLC is not a neutral, detached decision maker. It's not a court. But I don't believe that this OLC was just a rubber stamp. And, you would get a misleading impression if you only read its opinions that upheld exercises of executive power. Eric?
Yeah, I agree. It's just the OLC is never going to be a serious constraint on the president if he wants to do something. They don't have any power to stop him. I was thinking though, Jack, you should have named this book "Lack of Power and Lack of Constraint," because that's kind of what's going on.
I disagree.
It doesn't kind of trip off the tongue, but
I think
perfect.
you're good. Good.
Uh-oh, looks like Jack froze.
Oh, whoops. Well, in any case, we have Claude Pryor coming in with primarily a question for Professor Posner.
Wait.
If you'd like to go ahead there.
Can I just respond to Eric's joke about my last book?
Yeah.
I was just cut out. I don't know if everybody else was. There has actually been lots of constraint, and Trump has been powerful in some of the hard areas. He can pardon whomever he wants, basically, and the fewer bureaucrats and the fewer people outside the White House it takes to exercise presidential power, the better he's been. Foreign relations and war is a decent example. But so there's been a remarkable amount of constraint, which is not to say there's not a problem. But I agree with your insinuation, and I've actually been writing this on and off for 4 years, that in so many respects, and you and I are not the only ones to say this, in so many respects, Trump has been a weak president. He has not been able to accomplish his goals, even with the executive branch. I mean, I'm about to write an essay about how Trump has undermined the unitary executive, or shown why the unitary executive idea is just not the right model for executive power. The idea of the unitary executive is the president is at the top and he can snap his fingers and things should happen in the executive branch, and it's set up that way for a reason. That's a shorthand version of it. And that just has not described the Trump presidency. And we've learned a lot, I think. I think we learned a lot from that.
Thanks for that.
Sorry to interrupt. Apologize.
No, thank you. And so Claude is on the line here. Claude is an LLB graduate from Trinity and did her dissertation on the topic of demagogues. So she was actually questioning Eric Posner in our last discussion. She has an LLM from the University of Amsterdam and is currently with the legal division of the Department of Foreign Affairs. If you can hear us, Claude, you can go ahead there.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for this talk. It's really fascinating, and thanks Dr. Lyons again for organising such a great talk. My question is, I think, what a lot of Irish people are thinking about at the moment. Do you think Trump will or should be prosecuted after he leaves office, whether it's next week or in 4 years' time?
You want to take that one? You want to go first, Eric?
Yeah, let me start, and then I think unfortunately we agree here, Jack, but maybe we disagree in some respects. I think he should be prosecuted for anything that he's done as president. If he broke the law before he became president, and the New York prosecutors or even a federal prosecutor finds that he cheated on his taxes, sure. But first of all, I don't think he has broken the law. There's a kind of there's a reasonable argument that he engaged in obstruction of justice, but even that would be very difficult to prove in court and persuade a judge that there aren't any problems. And so any loss, any real trial would be a failure, and would both badly damage the Democrats who would presumably authorize the trial, the Justice Department if it was involved in it, and probably strengthen Trump as a private citizen and his movement. There's another possibility, which is kind of a political trial could be held that Congress, let's suppose there's a real Democratic sweep and Congress just said, we're going to hold a trial because we think Trump committed political crimes. I think that would be a terrible idea, but I wonder whether, something like that, well, I don't think it'll happen, but I think there'll be a lot of pressure. And if Biden's elected, it'll be important for him to resist pressure to go after Trump.
Let me just add a few things to that. Eric's right. I largely agree with that. Basically, for the reasons Eric says, I think it would be imprudent to, especially for this president, both because it's not clear what crimes he committed, and because of the damage it would do to the country and the next administration, I think it would be imprudent to investigate and prosecute Trump for his crimes in office. I agree. The ongoing investigations in state and federal court in New York for pre-presidential actions, I think, is entirely legitimate and should continue. I think it's going to. It would set a terrible precedent. We've already got the Barr investigation of the prior administration's investigation through the lens of criminal law, whether that was legitimate or not. We have the Obama administration doing a criminal investigation of the Trump campaign. It's just terribly corrosive, and I'm afraid we're falling into this pattern to have one administration examine the acts of the prior one or the one coming in through the lens of criminal law. And I think if Biden wins and goes down that path, we can expect to see this just become almost the norm, or at least an expectation. It's also going to be very tricky. It's going to be at odds with Biden's, if he wins, attempt to take the Justice Department out of politics. Because, by the way, there's going to be a huge push by Republicans to force the next attorney general to appoint a special counsel to investigate the crimes of the president and his son for all of these things that are in the news. I just don't have any sense about whether they're there, but I have no idea that that's going to happen. It's going to seem very incongruous for the Biden administration to not do that and to prosecute Trump. I think it seems like a good idea. My co-author, we disagree on this in the book, and he has a powerful argument about why it should go forward. And in a nutshell, the argument is the president is immune from prosecution during his presidency. That's the law of the executive branch, and I think it's right. He disagrees with that, but I think it's right. And you're in effect saying the president should be immune after his presidency for crimes committed in office. Maybe if, and this is some of our reforms, if some of the laws were tightened up and clarified so that we knew more clearly what a presidential crime in office would look like, or maybe if there was evidence uncovered of literally like a payment of a money bribe for a pardon or something like that. But absent extreme clarity in the law, I think it's kind of a fool's game. I don't think it will in success. But let me just say one final thing in response to what Eric's last point. There is going to be enormous pressure on the Biden administration and the Biden attorney general to do something. There will be, I predict, some kind of investigation. And it's going to be very hard to cabin. Once you start looking at the president, you're going to have to look at the president's family. You have to look at the people that worked with him. You're going to have to start looking through their records. I think it's going to be, the politics for Biden of not doing it are very painful. So I think it's going to be a very, very difficult episode.
Jack, let me actually ask you more about this, because so what the argument for, so Larry Kramer read a little short thing in the New York Times explaining why he thought the Democrats should pack the court if they come to power. And his argument is, well, if you know game theory, right? If people are cooperating and one cheats, you've got to retaliate, tit for tat. And as you point out in your book, and of course, as I say also, the Trump administration has violated all of these norms, super important norms. And I think the argument will be that if he's not punished in some way, then future demagogues will not be deterred from engaging in the same norm violations. And the irony here, of course, is, in game theory and in reality, the punishment is itself a norm violation. So I think Kramer acknowledges this. Packing the court's a norm violation, but it's justified by the earlier norm violation. So in a sense, it's okay.
Yeah.
And the same thing here would be the case. Since Trump's done all this bad stuff, even if we think that one should not prosecute the former administration for political crimes or what have you, made up crimes, because he's engaged in all of this bad behavior, will be justified in this type of retaliation.
Yeah, that's a good argument. And here's what my response is. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. There are many forms of retaliation and punishment besides criminal prosecution. I mean, accountability, there's a misplaced belief by many that accountability demands criminal justice. And that's just not true, as you've written about this. There are many forms of ex post accountability. I don't think we're going to have a truth commission, but going back to your Congress idea, I do think that there will, and in the context of reform should be, a review of what happened in the Trump administration to some degree as a predicate for reforming the presidency along some of the lines we've suggested. There's going to be, and so it's possible that Trump will be repudiated at the polls, repudiated in practice afterwards, receive all sorts of punishment because of the lawsuits he's got to be fending off, embarrassment before Congress. These all might be forms of punishment and repudiation that suffice to check the next demagogue from acting this way. And the other thing I would say is there's a difference between whether, on Larry Kramer's argument, tit for tat is justified, whether we can justify violating the norm because you violated the norm, but you also have to ask whether the retaliation is successful. And if you're pretty confident it's not going to be successful, you tell me. You're the game theorist. I mean, if you can't really impose punishment, and if there's a decent chance that it will end up in making your opponent better off, what does that argue for?
Well, it's the expected sanction. So as long as the probability isn't trivial. But, there are two theories here, though, about, norm violation. One theory is norm violation is actually not in the president's self-interest, let's say, for most norms. And so Trump is just being irrational or incompetent or stupid. He's violating these norms. They've hurt him. And so for that reason, no future demagogue or, power-hungry president or wannabe president will do it. And if that's the case, we have nothing to worry about, right? We don't even need your reforms in your book, although they'd certainly be sensible. But I think, your view and the view of a lot of other people is that these are really norms of political competition that can be sustained only if the other side's willing to retaliate. That's the Kramer view for the courts. The thing about the dilemma for the Democrats, for the court, is really quite extreme because, they could do a kind of legitimate type of response. For example, this proposal of having 15-year terms, but that wouldn't address the current problem, which is that at least for, before the system's put into place, you've got a huge conservative supermajority on the court. And so, if they want to not violate norms, they're helpless. They're stuck with this powerful court. If they do violate norms, then the new court they've created might be weakened. And plus, and I think that's really the dilemma. And it's the same for the issue of prosecuting Trump or trying to punish him in some way that would distinguish him from other presidents who've had to face lawsuits and deal with, post-presidency ostracism or whatever. And I do think it'll be a failure. I think all of history, the history of efforts to punish, previous administrations or previous, kings, or there are all kinds of historical examples. None of them work out well. Maybe with the possible exception of Nuremberg, and even that was.
Why is there not? I agree with you, and it seems completely foreseeable that this is not going to work out for the Biden administration if it goes down this path. Why is there not learning here?
Well, nobody knows any history, do they?
But even without knowing the history, the problems are pretty foreseeable. And the thing you don't want to do is end in failure. So unless you're pretty sure, go ahead.
Yeah, take Ford. I mean, I think Ford is probably a good example. He was punished for pardoning Nixon, that badly did his political standing.
Yes.
Later on, people thought that was the right thing to do.
Right.
But if he had understood that at the time, he would not have pardoned.
Correct. And by the way, I think the Biden presidency will and my co-author makes this argument in the book. The Biden presidency will the political cost, I think it's fair to say, will probably be worse, maybe be worse for Biden, or certainly be there. And although there are costs on the other side as well. And I think, the country is not, the country was, even though it was unpopular at the time, was more receptive to a pardon of Nixon then than it is to a pardon of Trump now. I think maybe that's not right. So, but there's going to be a lot of political pressure to do something against Trump on the theory that he has to be punished for his malfeasance in office.
So what should it be then? And so what's your view? So you
my view is that my view is that the executive branch should do everything it can to make it minimal to non-existent, and whatever it has to do to make that happen, whether it's we're going to delay and see what happens in Congress in terms of its hearings, or we're going to do a preliminary and look at the relevant law and see whether we think a prosecution is feasible. I think it should do the absolute minimum. And I think that Congress should, and I think it will, hold hearings, which will be circus-like in some respects, but it will bring out information. That will be a serious form of accountability. It might bring out, evidence of criminal acts, so we'll have to see what happens. But even that will be a circus that's going to be taking the oxygen out of the air for things the Biden administration is trying to get done. I think in an ideal world, I think the optimal solution for everyone is to do nothing, but I don't think that's a possible form of cooperation.
Yeah, but I just think, the trade-off you're making is you want political peace in the short term so that, reform can take place and Biden can accomplish something. But the risk is that there's no, future Trumps will just see that there's no price to be paid from failure. Nixon paid a price, right? He was forced out of office. But
I agree, but again, just to repeat what I said earlier, it depends on what price Trump pays on other dimensions, how he's treated after office, whether he is, still a revered figure whom 25% of the country admires, and he's still a kind of showman and still has influence, or whether he's so thoroughly repudiated by the party because he got so destroyed and destroyed the party so badly. I mean, if that happens, that might be seen as, there are other forms of accountability.
Yeah.
So if we move away from prosecution to prevention, one of the questions in the Q&A there is from Giuseppe Mazziotti. He's in Rome at the moment. He's one of the assistant professors in the law school. So he says that he was listening to Professor Goldsmith's remarks on how Trump abused his power and inevitably started thinking about Berlusconi's government in Italy as of the 1990s onwards. So obviously Italy does not have a presidential system, but the kind of behavior Berlusconi engaged in was very similar to Trump's behavior. Does this mean, in your view, that there is a rule or democracy defying or demagogue head of state government, that no government form can prevent these abusive figures from causing harm to their countries? And does this become a purely political and ethical issue as a result? Does that make sense?
Sort of. I'll give a short answer, but that might be a question for Eric, because his book is kind of about that. And I'll just give a short version of Eric's book. I mean, the U.S. Constitution was designed explicitly in mind with preventing. It's called the Demagogue's Playbook. And Eric, why don't you answer this question instead of me answering it for you?
Okay. Yeah. Well, let me say, I don't think there's any solution to this problem. So in the United States, we have a very powerful presidency, partly because the Constitution is vague, and partly because Congress has deliberately given power to the presidency by issuing statutes that give the president powers to do all kinds of things. And the reason this has happened is that congressional government is just not effective, not able to act quickly, not able to accomplish people's aims. There's gridlock, all the rest. And there's something inherent. The Congress in the United States is incredibly unpopular in public opinion polls for all kinds of reasons. But one simple reason may just be that the leaders of Congress just they come from one small part of the country, and they're trying to please their own constituents, not a national constituency. So the president has all of these advantages. And I think there's always been this kind of calculation that you give power to the president, he might abuse it, but we have to take that risk because the alternative is an ineffective national government. So I think one of the big questions with Trump is he so bad, and is our future president so likely to be like him, that we have to abandon this powerful presidency and go back to some other system, which we haven't had in at least 60, 70 years. Or, is he one off? And maybe he didn't do as much damage, as time passes and we look at the damage he did, it may not seem so significant, in which case there's not a whole lot of reason to change things, although, the sort of modest reforms that Jack proposes would certainly be sensible. I'm inclined to the latter, but I don't think we can rule out the former. It's just that it's very hard to know, what government we would have that did not have so much such a powerful presidency. And the interesting thing about the post-Watergate reforms, I agree with Jack that they helped a lot, but there was also a sense in which almost immediately presidents started fighting against them. And so you've got this, increasing conflict, and ultimate, in some cases, the presidents just disregard these rules. And so it's just not clear under our current system that even modest reforms would make much of a difference.
But may I have a follow-up with that, with Eric? But you were basically saying there that you think a powerful president is, but I think, what about it? Let me put it this way. So your book was about the ways in which the structures of our Constitution that were designed precisely to present a demagogic president have diminished somewhat over time, and that you didn't exactly say Trump as a result, but it was certainly made easier by the diminishment of these institutions. And you talked about near misses along the way. Is there some bucking up to do of institutions to assure more elite control at the presidential level, do you think?
So there are two types of institutions. There's the institutions that determine what president is selected, and then the institutions that control him after he's in office. And
I'm talking about the first, yeah.
Yeah, the first, it's funny. It's easy to talk about reforms that would reduce the risk that a demagogue like Trump would get elected in the first place. But it's hard to say what they are without sounding like you're anti-democratic. So, for example,
go ahead, Eric. You can do it.
I'll do it anyway. Back in the 60s and earlier, the candidates for the president, the Democratic and the Republican candidates for president, were largely determined by the party leaders, the party elites. So of course people voted in the general election, and so the masses chose between the Democratic and the Republican candidate. But the identity of the candidates were to a large extent influenced by the leaders, these elites. This system fell apart partly because Lyndon Johnson had been chosen that way and Nixon had been chosen that way, and people were angry with it. 100 years earlier, by the way, the same thing had happened. The primaries were introduced early in the 20th century precisely to give ordinary people more voice in selecting candidates, but the parties hated those restrictions until the 70s. So you could bring back some kind of vetting system. The parties could do it. One sort of hopes that the Republicans are thinking about this. If the Republican elites come to the conclusion that Trump badly damaged them, you could imagine them making internal institutional reforms that make someone like him less likely to be elected. So, maybe something like that could happen. It's hard to imagine a legal or constitutional reform that would make it less likely for a demagogue to be elected. I mean, one could speculate, for example, you could say a person can be elected to president only if he or she had held a major office before the presidency. And, that could weed out people who simply, lack governance ability. It would have also weeded out Eisenhower, though, it's not clear. But I think probably if someone proposed that, I just think everybody, ordinary people, that's just reducing our ability to select the people we care about. Yeah. So I think we're probably stuck to a large extent, which is why in my book, I don't, contrary to the book flap, I don't actually propose reforms. I think the only real solution to this problem is for the public to learn about the problem of demagoguery. So that could happen. But I don't think institutional reform is very promising.
But do you think the Trump supporters, when they learn about the problem of demagoguery, are not going to support him anymore? I don't think so.
Well, I think some of them have. It's pretty clear that a small minority of Trump supporters have withdrawn their support because of his demagogic behavior. But I think, if Trump loses the election, it's not going to be because of that. It's going to be because he botched the response to the virus. So at the margin, it could matter. But another example, though, I think would be the McCarthy era. So I think the elite, view of the McCarthy era on the right and left was that it was terrible. Although even as late as the 1960s, there were people on the right like William F. Buckley Jr. who were sort of elite types who defended McCarthy. But I think by now, no one
as did Bobby Kennedy.
Did Bobby Kennedy also?
You worked for him.
So, but now, calling somebody a McCarthy is a bad thing, right? And that could happen with Trump. That I think would be, a good outcome, but it may not happen. I don't know. I think a lot will depend on the election. And Jack, you were alluding to this earlier. If the election is just a total wipeout and Trump is destroyed, that may be enough, to prevent a demagogue from taking power for a while.
So you obviously disagree slightly on the extent of the reforms that are needed, and I am conscious of the time, but is there anything that you'd like to bring up, Professor Goldsmith, around the pardon power or special counsel or bureaucracy against the POTUS or the war powers? Because I know that they are kind of key issues within reforms suggested in the book, or have we covered those sufficiently?
I'm cognizant of time. I'll just end with one point. We've been talking about ways to constrain the president. And I think we only have one chapter on this, but I think it's vitally important, and that is ways to constrain the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy in response to Trump and to the Hillary Clinton campaign, the bureaucracy in large part out of lack of guidance and just fright in the face of this completely unprecedented figure, committed a number of errors in the investigation of Trump and the Trump campaign and the Hillary Clinton campaign. It turns out that investigating presidents and presidential campaigns is not something that the bureaucracy had by the bureaucracy, I mean the Federal Bureau of Investigation, including its senior leadership and the Justice Department. It's not just the bureaucracy. So anyway, we have a whole bunch of reforms that problem needs to be thought through from start to finish. There have been 4 Inspector General reports on these problems. They're serious problems, and the reports are very critical. And so the book is not, and the reforms are not just about bad Trump. They're also about other elements of the executive branch that need fixing.
I'm glad you mentioned this, Jack, because I listened to you talking about this book on a podcast, and it really made a huge, and you emphasize this point even more, but it really, it sort of reinforces how paradoxical this problem is. Right now, people who dislike Trump, they're celebrating the bureaucracy. They're celebrating for its autonomy, right? That's what's preventing Trump from doing worse, is that the bureaucracy refuses to do what he says.
Yes.
But the same autonomous bureaucracy, they're the ones who created a lot of these problems by investigating Clinton and Trump and doing it
and breaking a whole bunch of norms along the way.
But the normal solution when we think that the bureaucracy is autonomous and acts badly is to increase political control over it.
Which is what we propose across the board.
Pardon me?
Which is what we propose.
Yeah, but if we increase political control over the bureaucracy, then that's Trump. That's the next demagogue will have more power over the bureaucracy.
So we're at the end of the hour, and I don't have time to disagree with you, but all I can say is we work it out.
We'd love to take this up again. No, I really appreciated all of the insights that you had, and it sounds like it's a fascinating book. I've had the pleasure to read it, and I would recommend it to everyone out there. We'd like to express our sincere gratitude to Professors Posner and Goldsmith for joining us this evening, sharing your views on such pressing topics. You're 2 of the world's greatest public law theorists, as you know, and both books touch on vital debates relating to state governance, democracy, rule of law, and the institution of the US presidency. both offering positive and constructive reflection for the future of the presidency and the state. So thank you so much. And is there anything else that you'd like to mention before we wrap up? I'm conscious that we're over time at this point, but
I just want to say thank you both very much. I enjoyed it quite a lot.
it was fantastic.
Likewise. Thank you, Donna, for setting this up, and great talking to you, Jack.
Thank you so
Good
much.
to see you, Eric. Thank you, Donna.
With that, I'll close the session. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.